Dr. Laurel Bestock is Associate Professor of Egyptology and Archaeology at Brown, as you just heard, and she's taught there since 2008. She's conducted archaeological excavations in both Egypt and the Sudan, with a focus on the complicated life histories of royal monuments from various periods. At Abydos in Egypt, her team discovered the earliest known royal building of the enigmatic type that we call funerary enclosures, and these were probably used by early kings for royal rituals while they were still alive. And the one found by the Brown team has pottery that appears to date it to the reign of Narmer. That's way at the beginning, at the very dawn of Egyptian history. For the next 4,000 years, this area continued to be considered sacred, a sacred land in a variety of ways, and not just for private burials, but also as a monumental subterranean vaulted complex built for ibis burials. In its last ancient use, 2 of the vaults were turned into Christian churches with stunning paintings. In her most recent book, Dr. Bestock has brought her interest in military matters to an examination of images of war and other violence from the first half of Egyptian history, demonstrating how imperfect these records are for writing a history of conflict. She showed their importance, nevertheless, for understanding both ideology and the use of imagery itself in early Egypt. The same icon, she argued, could mean greatly different things in different contexts, where it would have been seen by different people. For her next book, she'll turn to invisible art in Egypt, images that were intentionally made unseeable, and how the interruption of vision gave power to art. In addition to her archaeological and art historical work, Dr. Bestock is committed to public service in her field, and she's also a passionate teacher. She's served for many years as a member of the board of the American Research Center in Egypt, where she's particularly concerned about building bridges with Egyptian scholars. In the classroom, she likes to make her students experiment with unconventional learning techniques, such as carving limestone reliefs and reconstructing ancient battles. So for those of you who might find yourselves in Providence on April 24th, you're invited to watch her class reenact the Battle of Kadesh between Ramses the Great and the Hittites on the college green. In the Sudan, which we'll be hearing about tonight, Dr. Bestock has been investigating a monumental fortress, not only to learn more about the king who commissioned it, but also to see how Egyptians and Nubians interacted in a place that was, and still is, extremely remote. Dr. Laurel Bestock.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, Jane, and thank you all for being here tonight. It's really a great pleasure to get to visit Harvard. Not only are you close, and I don't get up here often enough, but this is a really appropriate place to be talking about this work, and I will hope to show you that in a couple of different ways tonight, but most particularly the early archaeological work that was done at the site of Uronarti and its sister sites was done by a Harvard MFA team. And so you guys actually have a lot of the records. Peter's own work on the archives, particularly of George Reisner, are very relevant to my own work, so I can fold Harvard in a little bit here today. So as you can see here, and as you've already started to hear, the site that I'll be speaking to you about is a monumental and still very well-preserved fortress that dates to the early part of the 2nd millennium BC. It was one of a string of fortresses that the Egyptians built when they took control of the area that we call Lower Nubia, south of Aswan, along the Nile, but even into the desert areas, as we'll see today. So what I hope to do today is sort of give you a little bit of an overview, first off of this whole system of fortresses that were built in the Middle Kingdom, to talk a bit about how they worked and also what early questions were asked about these. Talk about the previous work that was done by the Harvard MFA team, and that there was no work done in between that the Harvard MFA team undertook in the late 20s and that we are doing now. The site was untouched for many decades. Then I'll talk a little bit about bridging the past and the present, how our research questions differ from those that the early team had, not just our questions, but also our techniques, and how that's sort of leading us to the type of work we're doing there. Most of the time that I'll be spending today, I'll be talking about both the methods that we've been using to tackle this site and then our finds at the fortress itself, but also a little bit away from the fortress. And then bring that back and look in conclusion at how our recent finds, in combination with the previous work that's been done at Uronarti, really shows us this building coming alive over time, not just as a pharaonic stamp in the landscape, but as a place where people lived and where people from different cultures interacted. And if there's anything I hope that you take away, aside from the fact that the Sudan is really beautiful and you should all go visit the Sudan, I really hope to show you that we can use sites like this and really bring the types of questions that archaeologists ask today to bear on examinations of identity in places that were contested and how complex an understanding of identity was even in the past. I hope to convince you that even the terms Egyptian and Nubian need to be, if not thrown away, at least understood to have more nuance than they sometimes are treated with. So as I said, Uronarti is part of a string of fortresses that were built in the 12th dynasty, predominantly by the kings Senwosret I and Senwosret III, who expanded the boundary of Egypt from its traditional area at the first cataract down south more than 200 kilometers to an area south of the second cataract at what we call the Dal Cataract here. Now, this wasn't strictly pushing the border south. This was not marching forward, establishing a fortress every time territory was conquered. There was only a relatively small local indigenous population of a group that we call the C group population here at this time. That doesn't mean to say that Egypt just marched in and took it over, but it wasn't fighting step by step. Rather, we understand the system of fortresses that were built as having sort of multiple purposes, not just territorial conquest, but protection of Egypt's southern border against a growing polity, oops, it's cut off, at the site of Kerma, which was growing in importance farther south in the Sudan. They weren't quite knocking on Egypt's gates, but they were a growing threat at this period. Also, we know that the fortresses were designed to regulate trade along the Nile. So all of Egypt's trade with sub-Saharan Africa is really coming along the Nile and through the desert routes that parallel the Nile in this area. Egypt has access to things like ivory and ebony and incense that would have come up through this route, and we know for certain that the fortresses were designed to regulate this trade. We'll see that in a little bit. But also, and one of the main impetuses we really think for building these fortresses is that this is a gold-bearing region. And these hills have a ton of gold in them. Egypt was mining gold themselves. In this territory, they were compelling the local populations to engage in gold mining. And we can actually see this even today. We encounter a lot of gold mining squatting camps around where we excavate, even today. And this is, in fact, a threat to sites in the region that people are going back and looking for gold even today. So these are sort of the reasons that Egypt took control of this area, and they did this by building a series of fortresses, as we say. So most of the best known ones are massive mud brick fortifications that are along the Nile. Down at the very southern end of this, where we are, you can see Uronarti here. This is an inset map because the fortresses get so dense in this area that they actually would have been intervisible between one another. So if you light a signal fire on top of Uronarti, that can be seen from the fortresses of Shalfak and Semna, where the southern border actually is located. But all along this area, from the traditional border of Egypt to the Semna Cataract in here, we have these fortresses built, particularly controlling the trade routes and the gold mining routes. The early work that was done on these fortresses really concentrated on this question. Why did the Egyptian kings want to conquer or control this territory? How did the fortresses enable that to happen? We still care about these questions, and we're still pushing these forwards. And this is work that's not just being done by the Uronarti team, but by other scholars in both Egypt and the Sudan. For instance, the eastern desert fortresses that you see here have been only relatively recently understood to be sort of part of this whole system of fortresses. Here you can see one of these. They have similarities to and differences from the fortresses that are built on the Nile Valley, but we really need to see these things as all working together. So again, rather than a step-by-step conquest of territory, an integrated system of fortresses along the Nile and in the desert designed to control people and territory and the movement of goods in this region. Now, by far the best known of these fortresses, the one that sort of serves as the type site for them, is the site of Buhen. Buhen had actually been occupied by the Egyptians starting in the Old Kingdom, but the fortification that's familiar to us was built in the Middle Kingdom, both by Senwosret I and Senwosret III. And in some ways, I show this to my students, and this is like a Roman citadel, or even like a medieval castle, a crusader's castle when you look at this. The level of fortification and military engineering here is intense. We have walls that are more than 5 meters thick. You have a very regularly planned inner fortress. What you see here, it looks almost like a moat on the plan. It is like a moat. only instead of being filled with water, it was left dry and whitewashed here with white plaster. Try crossing that as a single person in the night. You have no way of getting across that unseen. So it's both a physical barrier and a way of making people visible. And if you should try to cross it, every one of these slits is an arrow loop. So you can be shot at by people on the lower part below the wall and then above the wall as well. And that's just the inner fortification. The outer fortification is similarly well defended. So again, serious military architecture. The fact that it's mud brick instead of stone did not stop it lasting for 4,000 years. And in fact, would have made it a very effective military technology again as well. Brick lasts quite well. If you try and take a battering ram to brick, it just gets more compressed. If you try and light it on fire, it turns to ceramic. It's not bad. And the fact that this is stone doesn't mean that you should say, oh, the Romans did it better. The Egyptians knew what they were doing. But it's also interesting, the plan of Buchan itself tells us not only about the military objectives of this, the fact that we are really defending a garrison inside the inner fortress, but the outer fortress as well helps us understand these multiple purposes of the original intent of the fortresses, because this is territory that is then protected, but is not within the inner fortification. We really think of this as something like a caravanserai, a place that people who are coming to engage in trade of precious materials can be brought within the fortified protective boundaries of Buchan, but not allowed into the territory that is actually Egypt itself, this little ball of Egypt in the Sudan. In addition to the archaeology of the fortresses, we also have a number of texts that inform us about this sort of multiplicity of purposes here. We do have letters that were sent between the fortresses themselves and Egypt that talk about patrolling the deserts. They talk about looking for even very small numbers of people. I mean, really, you get a letter that's saying, hey, I was on lookout last week out in the desert, and we found tracks that said 36 donkeys and 12 men went north, and we tracked them. So that's not an invading army. That's really simply, it's the CCTV of the ancient world that you get here. The royal monumental texts, however, are also very useful for us in trying to reconstruct what the kings who built these monuments were really thinking. And here I can point to two texts that were left by Senwosret III. They're very interesting to examine in combination with one another because they seem to say very different things. And so I'll just pull out a couple of phrases for this. Here you have Senwosret III looking sphinx-like. In a Semna stela that he set up at Semna, that southernmost of the fortresses in year 8, he talks about precisely this trading need of the fortresses. And so he says, I built this place in order to prevent that any Nubian should cross it by water or by land with a ship or with 36 donkeys, except a Nubian who shall come to do trading in one of the fortresses itself. Those Nubians, it's fine, get off your boats, come ahead. You have to do it on Egyptian terms, but all of these Nubians are going to be allowed to pass. Now, for those of us who study Egyptology, we're used to royal statements about foreigners in particular being extremely bombastic, usually about how foreigners are craven wretches, people who shouldn't be respected. And there are plenty of statements about the Nubians that look like that, including the second Semna stela, of which there's a copy at Uronarti. So here you can see Senwosret taking credit for having extended his border farther south than his fathers had, but also saying, I'm a strong king, and the Nubians are craven wretches who will run away. And that's what these fortresses are doing. So again, looking at these in combination, this rather unexpected statement and this much more ordinary statement of royal power and foreigners' nastiness and unworthiness, if you will, I think is important for us getting a sense that these fortresses are doing multiple things, and that even from the royal perspective, there is a balanced expectation of their ideological importance and their practical role in regulating trade. And again, these are the kinds of things that the early excavators were most interested in. We'll talk about why we ask somewhat bigger questions in a second. So the first people who explored the fortresses with any sort of archaeological rigor were the team from Harvard and the MFA. And this was the larger expedition that was led by George Reisner, whose extensive records are so valuable to us as Egyptologists and as archaeologists in the Sudan. Reisner was doing so much at any given time that he, in fact, had almost nothing to do with the day-to-day running of Uronarti itself. He was very rarely on site. And that he subcontracted to a guy named Noel Wheeler, who Peter has done more to figure out about Noel Wheeler, who's an extremely enigmatic character. He was dismissed after bad behavior from Reisner's project, and he disappeared for a while, and Peter's actually relocated him. He died in Cyprus very shortly after I was born, so he had a long life after being kicked off the project. But the engagement of these two guys with Uronarti in particular is both of interest and also a challenge to us as we return to Uronarti. Reisner wasn't there. Wheeler was kicked off the project before the publications were put out. Reisner died before the publications were put out. And so the publications, we have a lot of information from Reisner and Wheeler from their notes, things like letters. This is a letter that Peter found and sent to me just the other day, in which Reisner claims completely incorrectly that they're not finding awesome stuff at Uronarti. Our definition of awesome has changed a little bit. So we have the documents that came out of the original field records that were kept by Wheeler and then the types of letters that were sent back. But the publications fell to the curator of the MFA, Dowes Dunham, who had not been a part of the team at all. He liked to jump out. He must have been a very interesting man. He liked to jump out and surprise people. So the publications of Uronarti then are really several stages removed from the actual excavation of Uronarti. And that, in addition to a limited set of research questions, the fact that they were done at a time when, frankly, archaeological approaches by American and European scholars to Africa were racist in the extreme, and that they were digging in a place that was extremely remote. All of these things make our access to the original excavations of Uronarti quite difficult. In fact, Wheeler's own notes have a tendency to be extremely brief about the archaeology and extremely extensive about the rigors of actually working there. So here you can see that the car is stuck. Our car gets stuck. The cars get stuck a lot. Getting to Uronarti is, in fact, very, very difficult. It gives you a great appreciation for how hard it would have been to be there originally, how supplying the fortress would have been really difficult. And we actually have a passage in Wheeler's notebook that talks about possibly this particular incident. His handwriting is another issue that we deal with. But he talks about having 5 men employed repairing the motor road. The southern mile of the road from Semna to Uronarti was getting really bad. A couple of months later, the crankshaft broke, and they couldn't even get the car over the repaired road. This entry just on getting stuck and having to make the road better is 3 times as long as the entries on the excavation of any of the rooms at Uronarti itself. So I'm simultaneously deeply grateful to Harvard and the MFA for excavating here in the first place. They did find some pretty awesome stuff, Reisner aside, but I wish they had kept better notes about a slightly larger range of things. Okay, so what did they find then? Well, the Harvard MFA expedition went out annually from 1928 to 1931 for very short seasons all the time. They did produce a plan of the fortress. The plan, in keeping with their research questions, the published plan was an interpretation of what the original fortress must have looked like in the reign of Senwosret III. It paid no attention to the architectural changes, some of which Wheeler had documented in his notebooks, but really not published. The architectural changes that took place over the use life of the fortress, which was probably about 200 years. They did find a great deal of material. You saw on Reisner's letter, he mentioned scraps of papyrus and ceilings. There is a great deal of inscriptional material from Uronarti. Here you see things like tags and ration tokens for the garrison and weights. This is the symbol for gold, so weights that are used in the process of getting and measuring the gold there. So from the documentary evidence that was excavated at Uronarti in particular, we really get a sense of the administration of this site, and in particular what its relationship was to the other fortresses. So we can say definitively that the different fortresses in the system all had very different roles to play. And again, they did combine to be really a system. It's a fortified border zone rather than a hard line in the sand in Egypt. But again, because of the questions that they were asking really about that first stamp, the idea of what was behind the Egyptian mind in establishing these fortresses, because of their methods, because of the remoteness and the time that this was done, the questions that were asked about Uronarti were, in fact, fairly basic, I would say, in terms of what we as archaeologists really desire to know about such an important place. Right? This is a place where 2 cultures collided anciently. The ability to go back and ask questions about the fortress system was extremely limited by the construction of the Aswan High Dam in the 1960s. So if you look at the area that was colonized by the Egyptians in the Middle Kingdom, it is exactly congruent with the area of the landscape that was colonized by the Egyptian building of the Aswan High Dam. And that was equally as disruptive to this landscape and the people who lived in it as the original Egyptian occupation was. So when the water rose behind the Aswan High Dam, you can see here, the Semna is right here. So these are, here you can see Uronarti right there. This is, in fact, just about exactly where the waters of the lake start. And because most of these fortresses were Nile-side, in fact, almost all of them were flooded. It was long assumed that the entire area was flooded, and no archaeological work was undertaken here after the campaigns in the 1960s to document this area before it was flooded, and the rediscovery of 2 of these fortresses in the early part of this millennium. So in fact, it's kind of surprising that we thought all of the fortresses were gone. They knew exactly how high the water was going to rise, and so this was a map that was produced when the dam was being built, saying, yeah, you know, Uronarti is actually going to be above water. Other pharaonic stuff on the island, not going to be above water, but the fortress itself will survive. And in fact, this is what happened. So if you look at satellite imagery, you can fly to Uronarti in Google Earth. It's really astonishing that nobody knew this was here for decades. But it was rediscovered. It was rediscovered by Derek Welsby of the British Museum in 2002 and first published to the archaeological community in 2004 as a sort of, hey, wow, we have to go and do something about this. It is still, however, such a remote area and so difficult to get to that it was another 10 years before a project was put together. And I was fortunate enough in 2012 to form the Uronarti project with my very good friend and colleague Christian Knoblauch, who's at in Vienna at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. And it has indeed proved quite a challenge. Here, there's Christian walking down the street of Uronarti the first day that we got to Uronarti. We got, our 4x4 was stuck in the mud. And we thought we weren't going to get to site on time, and we just got out of the 4x4 and left the poor driver and ran to the site because we were so excited to see it. So you can see that it is still very much present, very much clear, very much there to be found in Google Earth, and we were able to return to Uronarti as it was and start asking a series of questions, some of which are related to what had been done previously, but as I keep saying, some of these are really new questions. Just like the first expedition, the Egyptian expeditions in the Middle Kingdom and the Harvard expedition, our first question here, and it sounds silly, but it actually really isn't, is simply how do we get to site and how do we live here? There is no local population. Because of the rise of the waters, there has been a deposit of silt laid down relatively recently in the last decades that can be used for farming. The level of the water rises and falls over the course of the year, so it's very much like ancient Egypt would have been. Sometimes there is arable land and sometimes there is not. There had been a local small population sort of continuously from the ancient past. Because there had not been much arable land in the past before the construction of the dam, that population was never large. And even today, as people have started to come back to farm, we really have a very small population here. So we don't have any buildings to live in. We have no electricity. We don't have cell phone service. Forget the internet. We don't have people living nearby us. So simply being there, I've never been able to hire workmen, in fact, at Uronarti. I would have to bring them in from elsewhere. But the more immediate problem is food and how to cook it. We had one season where our gas canister ran out, and I was trying to get a gas canister delivered from Wadi Halfa, which is the nearest settlement, it's only about 60 kilometers away, but you have to go from the island to the riverbank. Then you have to drive your 4x4 through this landscape to get to the road, to get to Wadi Halfa. And it took me 4 or 5 days before I could get a canister of gas. And so during that time, my team had to literally chop down trees in order to make cooking fires in order to eat. And at that point, you are spending the vast majority of your time and energy feeding yourselves. There was not time for archaeology during that week. And that's how it must have been like living here. So we know that the people, the Egyptian garrison living at Uronarti, there's not a great deal of arable land here. We know from the ceramics that they're getting their pots, they're getting their grain from Egypt. For instance, if that delivery is interrupted, they're really in trouble. And there's more trees here now than there would have been anciently. Where are they going to get their firewood, the dung they have to feed animals to get the dung to fire their cooking fires. The process of living out here is not an irrelevant question. So I elevate it to the stage of a research question, even at Uronarti. But also the research questions that we're asking, again, have had time to grow and mature since Reisner's day and Wheeler's day. And really, we want to ask questions that are related to this. Not just how is it hard for us to live there, but what was it like to live here anciently? And I mean that in sort of two ways. What was the physical and social process of living out here within the sort of Egyptian community that is brought to Garrison, the fortress? But then also, how is this a place of cultural interaction? And we can access this in multiple ways. We can look at particularly how were things within the fortress changed over time. So that pharaonic stamp, Senwosret III has an idea up in Ichtawi and says, this is what a fortress should look like. This is what an Egyptian Middle Kingdom planned settlement should look like. Go build that in the landscape of Nubia. How does that get changed as people live there and interact over time? And we'll see that it does get changed extensively. But also the fortress is so far from being the only thing in town on Uronarti. What is going on outside of the walls? How can we trace, through material remains, the cultural interactions that we have here? So I'll address very briefly the issue of living there. I already told you about it with cooking gas. And then we'll look at some of the methods that we're bringing to answer some of these questions, and in particular at our excavation results. When I show you pictures of Uronarti, it looks really beautiful, and in fact, it is really beautiful, and I regard this month every winter that I spend out there as really a precious time away from the internet. You should try it. I highly recommend it. Like a whole month without Trump is amazing. But again, so it's great and easy and lovely in some ways and very difficult in others. We are camping. As you see, this is sunrise when my team is getting up and getting dressed in the lights of their own tents here. You can see we built a structure. Since we've been going for a couple of years now, we built a tiny structure that you can see here, but otherwise we are living outdoors. We eat outdoors, we cook outdoors when we have cooking gas, and cook at all, that is. And so it is in fact very rugged, and again, this is something that suggests important questions to us. Our other methods of tackling Uronarti have included a sort of suite of standard archaeological methods, some of which have been helpful and some of which have not. So for instance, we did a magnetometry survey. We shouldn't have bothered. Magnetometry looks for hidden things under the ground by looking at anomalies in the way the Earth's own magnetic field is interrupted. It is great when you have mud brick walls buried under sand, for instance. Well, the processes that have led Uronarti to look like it does today are not deposition. Uronarti isn't covered, rather Uronarti is eroding. This process was not able to find anything that we hadn't known about previously. We did pedestrian survey, so just walking across the site, looking at ceramics, looking for ceramics on the surface, looking for mud brick, any remains that might tell us of other areas that were used by anyone on site. And here, in fact, we were a great deal more lucky. We found, and this had not been documented previously, we found, and unfortunately it was the area that we had designated as our restroom, we found a stone tool production site. We have thousands of not just Mesolithic tools, but the debitage that shows us that they were produced there, and the variety of tools too is very important as a production site. This is definitely the earliest known occupation of Uronarti. More relevant to what we're talking about tonight, however, we also found a previously undocumented habitation site some 250 meters south of the fortress itself. We didn't really notice the pattern of stones from walking on the ground. That was something we had to send the kite up, and this is kite aerial photography we're doing a lot of. You can see here we have circular sort of collapsed piles of stones at various places here. We found the site because we found a great deal of Egyptian ceramics on the surface. And it was only, again, once we got the kite up that we saw, in fact, we had houses. And this is something that we can tell from earlier pre-dam aerial photographs from the RAF. We have identified two areas with these huts that are still above water, but this type of architecture seems to spread along the east side of the island, covering an extent that is actually greater than that of the fortress itself. So this was an area that we targeted for immediate excavation, and we also targeted areas within the fortress for excavation. And excavation, which is sometimes a challenge. We have trouble getting to site, but the goat herders have no problem. They love that we're there, and they show off. And so they also bring us goat milk, which is delicious. But they like to herd the goats through the fortress. So again, the processes that are making Uronarti look the way it looks are ongoing and erosional rather than depositional. But in any case, so this combination, survey to find sites and then excavation to examine the sites that we've found using survey and that we already knew to be there through the fortress itself. And these are really the two areas that are starting to allow us to answer these questions of how people used Uronarti over time, who might have been there, how they might have interacted there, happening at Site FC and at the fortress. So at Site FC, we've excavated a number of huts. We have excavated down to the bottom. You can see these are super crude. These are dry stone huts. This is a single room hut with a little bit of a windbreak. The windbreak was acting as a closet. So there were large storage vessels out here. We had a hearth inside here. This is a very, very basic type of domestic structure. Even when we have larger sort of honeycombed ones with multiple rooms, the rooms are always basically the same size. The material culture associated with them is always poor. And the architecture itself is quite basic. So there's not enough stone around for these to have been entire sort of beehive huts. This must have served as a foundation for walls in some more ephemeral material that has not lasted. So this is what we're finding at Site FC. The ceramics, again, I will return to this point, but the ceramics here are all 12th dynasty Egyptian ceramics. So this is contemporary with the fortress, and its material culture overlaps greatly with the fortress, but not in all ways. Our excavations up at the fortress are necessarily taking place in areas that were already excavated by Wheeler's team in 28 through 31. They cleared the fortress down to the ground, and so we're really not finding original deposits in many cases, although I keep finding pillars of intact stratigraphy, and I will be taking out a geomorphologist with us next season to sample these pillars and really get a sense of the strata in here. But rather what we're really looking at, so rather than looking at the artifacts, we're really looking for changes in this architecture. So how did this get modified? Who remodeled this how over time? And again, these are things that largely were ignored by the earlier excavators, but they're our best way of understanding how the fortress was used over time. So the area we've really targeted, we've first targeted for excavation one area, and we've started to phase another. We started off looking at an area where we think that we're looking at barracks. So an area where people were actually living. If you sort of look at the fortress as a whole, there's one main entrance to the south. You come in. There's a big building. We call it an administrative building down by the south gate. We have granaries up in the north and a treasury complex. But the area in the middle is really covered by houses that we think were used for the garrison themselves. And we decided to target our first effort of excavation. This might surprise you. Rather than going for the ones that look relatively well preserved, we were intrigued by the area that looked least well preserved. And that was because it did exhibit the greatest number of changes over time. So this is the area that we excavated a couple of seasons ago. This is from a 3D model. We're exporting these. This is how we do our plans now. It's much faster and easier to draw bricks from this area. But you can see what an absolute mess this area is. And so we said messes. We like messes. Don't come to my office. My office is a mess. Let's dig in there. Now, as I said, we have relatively little artifactual material in here, but I will point you to one exciting piece of material culture that we found in here. We found 2 fragments of teacups from the early 20th century. So we are excavating Wheeler up in here, and you can see the database record showing these. But otherwise, the artifacts that we're finding here are of much less interest than the architecture itself. Now, trying to figure this out is really complicated because Wheeler not only dug it to the ground, but he also did remove some walls that he felt to be later. We have then always to sort of triangulate between the published plan, which you see on the left, Wheeler's notebook, which you see in here. I love this published plan. You look at this and you say, there's one room with 3 room numbers. What on earth is going, you know that can't be right. And then you look at Wheeler's plan and you say, oh, that's right. That's because there are these little later walls, and this is an interpretation of what the original fortress must have looked like. People have tried to write dissertations about Uronarti with looking at where seal impressions were located and whatnot, talking about patterns of movement, and have relied on these plans, and you can't do it. They don't make any sense. But we do. We look at those, and we look at Wheeler's notebook, and then we look at what we actually find on the ground, which is a mess. And what we try to do then is look at the abutments and bonds of walls themselves to phase those and to say what was built when, what would have been still available in the later phases. And here we have been able to sort of pull out multiple phases. The first phase is not in spectacular shape because a lot of it was removed in subsequent phases. But we can go from what we think is a first phase where you have a very basic 3-room house here to a second phase with a much more complicated house here. And there are multiple implications of this that are worth addressing. So in the first phase, what we're finding up in this unit is a 3-room house. You can see that drawn on here, which is an identical replica of all the other houses at Uronarti. So again, this is state planning, bureaucratic Middle Kingdom at its best. This is a plan that is drawn up very far from Uronarti and is stamped onto this landscape. And it would have accommodated a front room for activities that are in common, and then probably 2 sleeping rooms in the back here. So this is then repeated all over the place at Uronarti. One of the things I wanted to point out to you too is that patterns of access change in our 2 phases. So it's not just the architecture itself, it's how you get to it. And in this early phase, this house that we were excavating is at the corner of 2 streets. So you can come up from the south of the fortress, come to the granary treasury complex, turn the corner and go around to the other side of the fortress here. In the second phase, as you saw here, that street is completely blocked off. It turns out this street is blocked off up here as well. So it's not just that the house looks different and incorporates different spaces, it actually does it in a way that means you can't move around the fortress in the same way. Now, in fact, the 2 types of houses, the first phase house and the second phase house that we can see, are well understood house types within ancient Egypt. And these are from the fortresses elsewhere, but this is the kind of most simple, basic form of a Middle Kingdom house. We find it at other state plan settlements within Egypt as well. The second phase house we have with a central room and rooms off the sides of it also seem, and probably a column tall in the middle, also seems to relate closely to patterns that we see elsewhere. So again, we can really see that the sort of state plan stamp get changed over time. Most likely, this relates not just to remodeling as things fall apart, but even to changing social structures of the people who are living at Uronarti. So the best explanation I can give you right now is that when the fortress was originally built, and its military nature was one of the most important things about it, it was staffed by a rotating garrison of people coming from Egypt. This is soldiers on tours of duty who are coming down, serving their time, probably years, it probably sucked, and then going back to Egypt. For a variety of reasons, including the fact that it's not until relatively late in the Middle Kingdom occupation of Uronarti that we get a cemetery at Uronarti. We think that it's only in the later part of its occupation. Instead of having rotating garrisons, we probably have people coming to occupy the fortress for much longer periods of time and having families with them. Now, whether or not they're creating families from Nubians who are living nearby or bringing their families from Egypt is something I can't answer. But the change in house structure to accommodate different social structures and different administrative functions within the fortress. Some of these first stage houses end up becoming storerooms and places where we have zillions of seal impressions later on. I think that really shows us a lot about how this fortress itself changed over time and how it was occupied changed over time. We will continue to work in the barracks in coming seasons, but what we tackled this winter was rather architectural changes in one of the more monumental sections of the fortress. So again, if you come in that south gateway, and this is now looking, I'm sorry, north is down. That's a terrible thing to do to you. North is here. If you come in the south gateway, the first building you hit is the administrative building. I've been fascinated by this building from the beginning, and I finally let myself go play in it this last winter. I'm fascinated by it in part because it again shows a great discrepancy between the published plan and what we can see on the ground. And that's again because you have this kind of intense architectural remodeling. And it's particularly in this front room and also this room here, which was narrowed by the addition of massive walls. This wall was tripled in thickness at a later phase. This front room had an addition of a stairway. The stairway itself was replastered and remodeled multiple times. So real reconfiguration of the space. Again, an addition of a second story, a narrowing of rooms, even a closing off of rooms at some period. So I wanted to play with it. And we've started doing this. We haven't started excavating this, but we have started recording some of these changes. So what I really do here, using a combination of ground observation and the models that we're building from kite aerial photography, I take Wheeler's plan and I'm marking it up in this way. It's also, I can use Wheeler's plan and Wheeler's own notes to create records in our database that allow me to bring Wheeler's own material in here, which we'll get to in just a second. But it was cool. So when you can see here, I hope you can even see this. The bricks of this bit right here are a totally different color than the bricks of the original wall. There are different brick recipes used at different phases, which helps me enormously in phasing walls at Uronarti. And this was built up against the wall at a later date, and this has been great for me. I brushed aggressively behind it. I wasn't actually excavating, but I brushed a lot this winter. And the color doesn't show up at all, unfortunately, but I found behind this thing, this protected part of the original wall surface of that room, which was red plastered. Must have been beautiful. I don't know if I've just hit, if it was all red plastered or if I've hit a piece of figural decoration even. I need a conservator out with me before I can tackle that. But at least we know that this front room was really something quite special at one time. Okay, so then we have architecture at the fortress that is massively modified over time. We have architecture of a very different nature at Site FC, an extramural settlement that was not modified over time. In starting to compare the monumental and particularly the barracks fortress within the barracks areas within the fortress with what we have at Site FC, we start to get to some of the hints of how much more complex and interesting this site is than had been recognized. So just to kind of recap, here at Site FC, we have round huts. The rooms are all the same size. There's no overall layout to the site at all. You don't have streets. You don't have a single right angle on here. No streets. No clear divisions between buildings. You have no wall surrounding the area, no definition of the area itself. You have a settlement, but it doesn't look anything like the settlement up at the fortress, where you have a different building material. You have everything has a right angle. You have changes over time. You have streets. You have the whole thing encased within a defining wall. So really, we can say that at the same time, then, we have people who are living in very different ways on this island. We can't understand what's going on at the fortress without understanding that it has a dependent population that is living nearby, but not so directly under the fort walls that they could run inside at the first hint of trouble. And they're living in a very different way. Now, in order to sort of flesh this out, of course, we need to start looking at the artifactual record. And at FC, we can do this because this hadn't been discovered until we saw it. We can do this through excavation. When we do this up at the fortress, we need to include other types of records, so including going back to Wheeler's records. So as I said, the material culture that we're finding at Site FC includes almost entirely ceramics, and we have a few stone tools, but mostly ceramics. They are ceramics that are all dated to the Egyptian 12th dynasty. Interestingly, they are all dated to the earlier part of the occupation of the fortress. When we first found the site, I thought, oh, maybe this is overflow. And so you get too many people living in the fortress, yes, stick them outside. Can't be. These are people only from the first half of the occupation of the fortress. They are a subset of the types of ceramics that we find at the fortress. So we get the types of drinking vessels and eating vessels, hemispherical cups, which are entirely characteristic of the Middle Kingdom. We get the large storage vessels and food production vessels down here as well. What we do not have at Site FC are bread molds. Anyone who's worked in a Middle Kingdom settlement knows that we should have bread molds. They're ubiquitous at the fortress. We don't find them here at Site FC. A lot of the ceramics are broken in ways that also suggest that they were cast-offs from the fortress itself. So for instance, a lot of vessels are complete except for their rims. So they've already been used, basically, by the time they're getting here. We also, instead of stone tools, which are ubiquitous at the fortress, we have a few down here, but most of the tools are actually sherds that are being repurposed as tools. So we can say a lot about this population then, living in a different way, living at only the first half of occupation of the fortress, dependent upon the fortress, rather poor in comparison to the fortress, and really particularly for bread, perhaps dependent on the fortress. Now, when we look at the material culture up at the fortress, here we're doing two things. So we have actually done some excavations in Wheeler's dumps, and that's been amazing. We find all sorts of good stuff. Again, Reisner had a different definition of good stuff than I have. So stone tools, stone grinding. This is a kern for grinding grain. We have grinders up the wazoo. We do have sherd tools as well. We have lithics up here. We have an enormous amount of pottery. The pottery that we find is very interesting. We have all of those forms that we find at FC, plus we have the bread molds, plus we have another type of pottery up in the fortress dumps that is not seen down at FC, and that is pottery that directly speaks to the issue of interaction between communities. We have a lot of Nubian pottery on Uronarti, but it all comes from the most Egyptian-looking part of the site. It comes from the fortress. And so up here at the fortress, we have things like kerma-ware beakers. We have incised C group cooking pots. In fact, while only a small percentage of the pottery as a whole from the fortress is Nubian, a fairly large percentage of the cooking pots are Nubian. So again, food supply, especially the staples, coming from Egypt. Food production techniques, the cultural aspects of making food, are looking pretty Nubian up here at the fortress, again, within this fortified Egyptian area. We also find a great deal of a type of ceramic that is a hybrid that is only found in the region from Buhen to Semna. And this is, we call it goldenware. It's got a micaceous slip on it, and it glows when you pick it up. It's quite lovely. It's a wheel-made pottery. All the Nubian indigenous wares are handmade, but this type of slip is really only produced here. So again, this is something that is neither Egyptian nor Nubian. It is only that area where people are interacting. So the ceramics then, the difference in the ceramics between FC and the ceramics up at the fortress, and the presence of these Nubian and hybrid wares that we have up here really start to inform us about who's living here and who's doing what. We also find, believe it or not, inscribed material that Wheeler overlooked. He was going so fast. Again, remember, he talks more about the car than about the excavation. And he must have been throwing things over his shoulder as he was going. So types of objects that he did pick up when he saw them, he often missed. And so we find things like seal impressions. Of the hundreds of types of seal impressions that have been found at Uronarti, we're still finding ones that are new. This is the closest parallel. So this is an administrator who was known already to us in the record, but the particular seal is new. We found one fragment of a stela here. That stela has pairs. I'm not sure it actually matches up, but it has at least pairs in objects that were found by Wheeler and recorded and that are on the records that are now at the MFA. And I have an undergrad student who's actually working on researching the stela fragments because I think they might turn out to be quite interesting. So that's just in excavating the dumps and seeing the things that Wheeler missed. But we're also able, and this is fun for us, we're able to bring in the legacy data into our own recording system as well and get things like the field notes, the field photographs, and even the objects into our recording system so that when I query my own archaeological contexts around, this is from room 12 in the administrative building where we were working this winter, I can pull up the Wheeler records as well, Wheeler and the Dunham published records as well. So all of this allows us to sort of put together this more complex picture. And interestingly, Wheeler, in fact, did often find things that are related to our own most exciting finds. But he didn't note their importance. He was not interested in the questions that most excite us about Uronarti. And here I want to return to those. So putting this together, putting the architecture and the artifacts together here, I am left, in fact, with more questions than I had when I started looking at Uronarti, even more questions than I had when we first found Site FC. When we first found that, I really had expectations that we were looking at an essentially Egyptian garrison in the fortress, supplemented by a perhaps Nubian support population outside. The thing that led me to think that was really the style of architecture itself. Architecture has often been taken as a proxy for ethnicity in this region. Mud brick rectilinear architecture is Egyptian. Round stone, dry stone architecture is Nubian, is C group. I think that when we add the material record in here, the complexity of the material record, not just the architecture, but the pottery, you can start to see how problematic that assertion is. We do not have purely Egyptian stuff going on at the fortress. When we are talking about having Nubian cooking practices up there, we are not just talking about trade and interaction. We are actually saying people lived there in ways that are not even just hybrid. They are this great mixture of things that we consider fundamental to our expressions of ethnicity. The types of houses we have, the types of food we cook, these are really fundamental markers of how we consider ourselves to be in the world. So that's what we have up at the fortress. We have Nubian life ways coexisting with Egyptians. And here it's a good idea to remember that the Egyptian army itself was always multi-ethnic, and there were always Nubians even in the Egyptian army. But even more interesting is this thing that we have going on at Site FC. If we have Nubian architecture and all of the material culture is Egyptian, here outside the walls we do not have any evidence of people living in Nubian ways, then I think we have to step back and say that this type of architecture can no longer be understood itself as a proxy for Nubian groups. This is important to us because we have only legacy data to deal with when we look at most of the archaeological remains in this area. We have to go back to the earlier notes. This area is flooded. The recognition that there were sites with this type of architecture scattered throughout this territory was large when the surveys were done in the 60s, but it was always assumed that they were C group, that you could make an absolute prediction of which people lived how because of the architecture. We have to go back and reassess all of that now and ask about the more complex material record to approach it from an understanding of ethnicity that admits that we are not looking at a binary distinction between Egyptians and Nubians, but rather at a place that was so difficult to live with people of different backgrounds that they created multiple new identities and expressed them in a range of ways that are only partially accessible to us today. Thank you very much. Whew.